Hello and welcome back to my channel, Cicada Reads. This is my January reading diary. If you watched my first video, I kind of just did an introduction to the kind of books that I like, and this month is going to be kind of like a monthly thing where I'm going to go through all the books that I read in the previous month. This video is a little bit late because January was just a very busy time of year. Speaking of, I'm actually kind of surprised that I managed to read 6 books this January. Some are longer than others. You'll see when we get into it. But yeah, it was a very interesting month. A very busy month for me. So again, I was kind of surprised, but also a very up and down month. You'll see when I get into my kind of ratings. I didn't have the best luck with reading this month. There were some books I really liked, some books I absolutely loved, which I will talk about, but other books that I kind of just ended up being kind of indifferent on, which is not really a fun place that I like to be. If you want to see more in-depth thoughts about any of the books I talk about, I do post extensive enough reviews on my storygraph, which is in the description if you want to follow me there. Again, I'll be posting pretty much everything. I try to leave a review for every book that I read, unless I have literally nothing to say, which is very, very rare. I'm going to be giving you my star ratings for these videos. One thing I want to get out ahead of is I know a lot of people get kind of uppity about star ratings. I think, personally, star ratings are pretty worthless in the grand scheme of things, unless you're going to use them as intended, as a way of kind of going, oh, well, I really love this book, or I really didn't like this book, or I thought this book was flawed, whatever. So I know a lot of people say, they won't give a 1-star review. I'm not above giving a 1-star review. I think I have a couple on my storygraph already. But to me, a 5-star book is obviously a book that I adore, love. Doesn't mean it's perfect. I don't think a 5-star has to be perfect. It just has to be perfect to me. And I think, 4, 3, 2 are all fair rankings for books. A 2-star doesn't necessarily mean it's like the worst book I've ever read. It just means that there were things in it that I didn't like, or it just didn't land with me in the way it was maybe meant to. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about star ratings, but just in case anybody decides to get in the comments and say, I can't believe you gave this book a 2-star, that means it's the worst book ever written. It doesn't. It means that, it's a book that I enjoyed parts of, but there were less parts that I enjoyed than there were parts that I didn't like. Or there was, say, one big flaw that kind of took me out of the book entirely. That's where I usually stick to 2 stars. 3 stars tend to be books that are completely inoffensive. Books that I enjoy just fine. A lot of crime books would fall into this category, books that are just pure entertainment. And if they're really good entertainment, they might get a 4-star. Very rarely will it get like a 5. And then 4s are books that I really like, but I wouldn't say they're my favorite. And then 1-star is 1-star. I mean, if we ever get a 1-star book on this channel, you'll know. Usually it's a book that offends me deeply, on like a deep level, one that you feel like you wasted your time reading. But yeah, so we're going to get into the books that I read in January. So one of the problems with doing this video is that I don't actually have most of the books from January in my possession at the moment. Some were copies that I borrowed from people and gave back, and some were advanced copies that I don't actually have a physical copy of. So the first book that I read was The Hill in the Dark Grove by Liam Higginson. This is a Welsh folk horror story. I wanted to start January with something kind of spooky because, it's still dark months. The winter here in Ireland is grey and miserable, so, it's nice to read something that's kind of miserable. It follows this farmer who lives on this land that he's had, in his family for generations. Him and his wife live there. They're kind of aging, but they've no kids, so the farm is kind of not falling into disrepair, but they're kind of not making as much money as they used to. There's lenders coming to the door all the time, and they're kind of the last of their generation to kind of work on this farm. And the husband finds a sort of weird kind of dig site on his land and is compelled to dig up whatever's underneath here. And he starts finding all of these weird artifacts, these like pre-Christian and Christian settlement artifacts that are underneath the ground. Very easy setup for a folk horror story. You can kind of see where things are going. There's some elements of maybe possession, or is it just kind of obsession? those kind of things that make horror really interesting. You know, there's this kind of tightrope walk between, is the protagonist just kind of going crazy because of other external factors, or is there actually something magic going on with the horror kind of setting? One thing that I really love about this book is that it's set in Wales and it's written by a Welsh man, so there's a lot of very specific folklore being used. There's a lot of stuff that you learn throughout the book. Like, I'm not Welsh. If you are Welsh, you might know a lot of the stuff that's in this book. But there's a lot of like Welsh language. He kind of throws in words like a native speaker would, you know, having a full sentence in English, but just throwing in a Welsh word randomly, which is really nice. And it's really nice to see a culture that doesn't really get spotlighted a lot. I know when a lot of people talk about the UK, it's, you know, England, Scotland, and then Wales is kind of almost like the forgotten child. So it's always interesting, and I've always felt an affinity for the Welsh. I think the Welsh are very, very cool, you know, culturally, and very interesting people. And the fact that they fight so hard to keep their language alive, I think is really, really cool. Yeah, it's a really interesting book. It goes places that you might not expect from the description that I've given you. It's kind of ultimately about relationships. You've got this, you know, man kind of being driven to obsession by this want to dig up this place, and his wife, who is kind of watching the man that she loves kind of disappearing and turning into something that he's not. Kind of gets a little bit like Shining-y near the end. There's a little bit of that, like trapped in a house in the middle of nowhere with somebody that you don't really recognize anymore. It's really interesting. I don't think it's the best horror book I've ever read by any chance. But I was really pleasantly surprised with it. There's a lot of stuff about kind of colonialism, and how, you know, Christian missionaries came along to Wales and kind of usurped the pagan gods, which, if you're, again, from somewhere like Ireland, that kind of hits pretty hard as a theme. But kind of, yeah, talking about how Christianity as a religion is quite a new thing in the grand scheme of the world, and kind of having it be put opposite a sort of ancient, more kind of mystical, nature-based kind of gods, that kind of thing. It's that kind of folk horror. If you know what I mean, if that meant anything to you, then you should know what I mean. But yeah, I ended up giving this a 4-star. I really enjoyed it. I didn't think it was perfect. I thought the ending was a little lackluster. It's got that horror problem where I think every single horror book I've ever read has some sort of lackluster ending. You know, there's only so many ways you can end a story like this. And I think he did a great job of doing it, but I don't know, a little bit, could have wanted a little bit more. But yeah, that was a good way to start the month. Nice, easy read. Would recommend it if you're into folk horror. The second book that I read, I picked up specifically because it was a very short book and it had been sitting on a pile for ages. This is Hunger by Choi Jin-Young. She's a Korean author. I guess you'd call it like a thriller, like a crime thriller. It starts with, it's got this very evocative cover, as you can probably see on the screen now. But it starts with this description of this woman eating the body of her boyfriend. And obviously the book leads up to that as the ending, I guess. Like that's what the whole story is kind of leaning towards. Like, how did you get to this position? There's been a real uptick lately in cannibalism books. Like, cannibalism horror has always been a thing, but like in the last like 3 years, I feel like maybe longer, there's been a lot of these kind of books, and like especially like cannibalism as an expression of love. I don't think I really liked this book that much. It was enjoyable for what it was, but it's like less than 200 pages, and it feels like it's less than 200 pages. Like, there's no real detail to anything. The descriptions aren't really there. It's quite lackluster in that way. The story is fine. It's basically about these two kids who you get to see their relationship from when they were young kids in like elementary school or whatever, all the way up to their mid-20s and 30s when they meet some sort of tragic end. And in that regard, it's fine. It shows quite a toxic and obsessive relationship very well. But to me, it was just missing substance. It was missing that kind of detail and that kind of color that I really want in a book. It was very much internal dialogue and thoughts and character motivations with no like feeling that the world was really, I don't know, shaped out in any way. It switches back and forth between the two of them, so you kind of get both perspectives on it, which I appreciated, because for the most part you think you're reading the woman's perspective, But then you end up kind of, again, seeing his perspective and seeing how they kind of fall for each other and kind of move, ebb and flow back and forth and back and forth. And they go through traumatic events that kind of make them have a bit of distance for a while, and then they eventually come back together. The actual kind of social and cultural commentary is interesting. I guess kind of a critique of capitalism and Korean culture in general, and it does get into some pretty nasty scenes, especially with what happens to the boyfriend by the end of the book. But yeah, I ended up giving this a 2-star because I don't really usually like books like this. I think, again, I just want a bit more meat on the bone, and I felt like this, for a book called Hunger, sure did leave me wanting more. It was fine. I think if you like these kind of books, you might enjoy it. You'd read it in an afternoon, probably like on a lunch break. Like, it's not only is it like really short, it's like half of the pages are like half empty, because it'll go like paragraph from her perspective, skip to his perspective, half a page, skip back and forth. And sometimes there's obviously longer sections, but for the most part it is just quick short bursts of thoughts and opinions and feelings. So yeah, not my favorite book that I read, but I think this is an example of a 2-star that's more like disappointing than like actively mediocre. Like, I think the writing was fine for what it was. It's just not the kind of thing that I normally read. So that was Hunger. Next we have one that I do still have, and I was, again, kind of disappointed in. This is Heap Earth Upon It by Chloe Michelle Howarth. This is the author of Sunburn, a book that I haven't read, but I do want to read it after reading this. I know a couple of fans of hers that were uninterested in this book, funnily enough, because as far as I know, this is very different to Sunburn, so I'm interested to read Sunburn. But this is a gothic kind of Irish fiction book. Sunburn was kind of, as far as I know, it's like a, lesbian love story, but dealing with rural Ireland and in the 80s and oppression and all that, the stuff that I kind of love normally. And this follows in that tradition, but kind of changes it to a gothic story. So you've basically got this family who have moved to this new town. You immediately are just thrown into it. You don't know who they are. You don't know their relations to each other. At first I was thinking like, oh, like he's the dad and that's like, or maybe that's the mom and that's the stepdad, which is weird kind of for that era of Ireland. But I was like, okay, and then maybe that's the son and that's the daughter. And no, you figure out pretty quickly that they're all brothers and sisters. Their parents are dead. They've moved to this new town and they want to just completely erase all of their kind of past. And there's this figurative and literal ghost that's kind of following them. So there's this character named Lillian, who something happened to her that kind of caused them to move. And that's where the mystery comes in. The mystery is ultimately like, what happened to Lillian? What was all the relationships that these characters had with her? And why was she so important to them that her death kind of causes them to just throw their whole life away? It's a very lopsided book, I think, because it jumps between 4 perspectives. There's the 3 siblings, the main 3 siblings, and this other woman in the town who ends up kind of connected to them and kind of figuring out, she's kind of the detective almost for a lot of the book. So the 2 brothers, Tom and Jack, are kind of insufferable, and I think that's done on purpose. Anna and her story with Betty, who's the neighbor character, is by far the most interesting part of the book. It's really heavy and really dark, and it kind of depicts, again, like obsession and how that kind of can be mistaken for love and repression and all this stuff, and mental illness in the 60s in Ireland wasn't exactly the most, understood thing, so you end up with a lot of characters who are clearly traumatized and clearly dealing with some heavy issues, but having no outlet for it other than religion and oppression, just repressing it down. And Anna and Betty's storyline is really, really great. I think if the whole book had have been kind of focused on that, it would have been more interesting to me. But because every time you're kind of getting into her mental state and you're following her perspective, it jumps back to Tom or it jumps back to Jack. They do play an important role, and I don't want to say that it's a waste to do it like this. I understand where she was going with this kind of a narrative, or this kind of a narrative structure, I guess. There would have been more substance to it had she just kind of spent more time with these characters rather than kind of a little bit of time with everything. Because, like, this book, it's not the shortest ever, but it's not long. And the font, I don't know if you can see this, the font is pretty big. Like, you don't get a lot of page or words per page. So, I don't know, it kind of ended up, kind of the similar problem that Hunger had, where I felt like it was just kind of not doing enough with the premise. There is one section, about maybe 100 pages in, where you find out what happened to the mother of the family. Because you know the dad, early on, you know the dad kind of died in a farming accident to do with like a bull. But when you find out what happened to the mother, it is one of the most like heartbreaking and really like tragic scenes I've read in a long time. If you heard me talking about Claire Keegan in my first video, it's along those lines. And you get to hear, and this is where I think the perspectives kind of works, because you get to hear Tom justify something that is unjustifiable, like something that is just horrific. So, again, I think that really, really worked. But I think a lot of Jack's sections, he kind of just spends most of the book like reminiscing about Lillian. And there is a point where you're reading like a really interesting section with Anna. Like, things are really heating up. The kind of gothic elements are all there. It's really starting to feel really interesting. And then it jumps back to Jack, like, working in the pub, being like, oh, and her hair was so soft and beautiful, and her eyes were like pools of water. And it's like, yeah, I know you were obsessed with Lillian. It gets a little bit repetitive. I think in my review I said something like, it feels like she's like hammering a nail into the wall, but like the nail is already like on the other side. And she's still, hammering away at it. It just feels a bit like she ran out of things to write about at a certain point with some characters. But instead of spending more time with the characters that she did have a lot to say about, she kept having to include them because, she's already set the precedent that she's jumping between all the narratives. I ended up giving this a 2.5, which I think is probably a little low. I think maybe a 3 is more fair, but really I was just kind of disappointed with how it kind of managed to drag, even though it was so short. I think if it was written differently, I think this could easily be like a 4 or 5. I love the ending. I think the ending is really tragic and, again, falls into that kind of gothic tradition of a very like bleak and kind of uncertain ending. If you want to read a book that's similar to this, that doesn't deal with the same themes necessarily, but has the same kind of feeling to it, I always recommend Where I End by Sophie White, which is another Irish author. She does the kind of gothic small town Ireland story really creepily. It's not necessarily the best like story-wise. I think the plot's a little messy, but for like atmosphere and feeling, like the Anna and Betty stuff in this, if you enjoy that, I would highly recommend Where I End by Sophie White. But yeah, I will read Sunburn. Kind of disappointed with this, but I'm hoping that I like Sunburn more. Next, we're going way, way back in time, and I read this one actually. I started in November, I'll be honest, which I'll talk about in a minute, and I kind of took a break and came back to it. Finished it in January. This is Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. I've never read a Dickens before. I read a bit of Hard Times a couple of years ago and never finished it. Not for any particular reason. I think it's just at the time I just wasn't really reading as much as I am now. But this is my first Dickens that I've actually finished from like page 1 to the final page. Again, I started this in November. Great lesson in starting a book at the right time. I think if I had started this in January, I probably still would have finished it in about a week and a half. But because I was so busy over Christmas, obviously everybody's busy over Christmas, it just ended up falling to the wayside, because it's not hard to read necessarily. I think Dickens, he's no Victor Hugo in that he's not really rambling, but there are sections where you're like, oh, I can see that you've got like an axe to grind, and you're kind of just like pretending you're talking about the characters, but you're actually talking about some societal issue, which is fine. I think it's really interesting, and there are times where like the characters in the story kind of takes a back seat for a minute while he just kind of pontificates about things. Other than that, though, shockingly easy to read. I think it falls into that thing of classics that are enjoyable even now in a modern day. And if somebody was like, oh, like I want to try a classic, but I don't know, it's all so hard to read. It's like, well, I mean, you can try Oliver, like, and everybody knows the story of Oliver. I'd never read Oliver as a kid, but like I'd obviously seen the musical. I definitely watched the movie in school as a kid, and I didn't remember much of it. But like, I think up until the end of book 1, which is all the stuff with Oliver in the workhouse and Fagin and Dodger and all that, like I think those characters and that setting, like, it's impossible not to know it. The stuff that people might not know are things like The Inheritance and Brownlow and Rose, things like that. Because a lot of those characters were kind of cut in adaptations for good reason. I think the Rose Maylie side plot is kind of dull. The worst part of the book is the middle act, book 2, where Oliver's recovering in this countryside and he's kind of been restored out of Fagin's gang. And the reason for that is just because, well, Fagin and Bill and Nancy are kind of the heart of the book, in my opinion. Especially Nancy. Like, Nancy is worth reading the book for alone. I think her storyline and her, you know, she's the quintessential archetype of, like, the tart with a heart. She is such a wonderful character. She's so interesting to read. She's fun to read, but also her kind of where her plot and where her storyline goes, I think, is really tragic. And you can tell that Dickens had a lot of empathy for her and people of her station, even though there is an element of maybe projection. There's also a lot of stuff that obviously he couldn't outright say at the time because of censors and stuff. You know, Nancy is very clearly a prostitute, or sex worker. But at the time, obviously, he couldn't say that because that would be indecent. So he kind of uses little words of the time that kind of allude to it, but he won't outright say it. So things like that, I think you kind of have to get over as a modern reader. But I think, yeah, Bill and Nancy's storyline is fantastic. I think the way that Bill's story ends is so satisfying, and I can't believe that every other adaptation they kind of reduce it a little bit, but it's so dark and it's so well done. Really good book. I think I gave it a 4-star in the end. Again, I think it's not perfect because the whole middle act is kind of but if it's something that you've been wondering about trying classics, or if you've never read a Dickens, obviously can't speak for any of his other stuff. I know his other stuff is a lot longer. The thing you need to know about Dickens is that he was always writing for magazines that he got paid by the word. That's something that a lot of people say, and it's very obvious at times when you're reading certain sentences that you're like, oh, you were padding this out to make more money. Which, hey, listen, can't blame him. But it's a miracle that somebody writing at that time with those kind of stipulations managed to write something so good that it's like still worth reading to this day. So I think, yeah, give it a try if you've never read it. If you have read it, I mean, you probably read it. A lot of people. I'm pretty late to this one, let's be real. The second last book that I read this month is another one that might get me raked over the coals a little bit. I'm a firm believer in reading stuff that's outside of your wheelhouse, and reading stuff that isn't for you. I think it's really important to not fall into this kind of weird thing that people do where they're like, well, this is a book aimed at children, or it's aimed at teenage girls, or it's aimed at older men, or whatever. And it's like, you can say what a book is like marketed towards or what it's mainly for, but that doesn't mean that you should like lock yourself out of that just because it's aimed for that demographic. You are not a marketer. You can move outside of demographic studies. So I always try to read stuff that I think, again, is not written for me or with me in mind, but I think I can read them with an open mind and see if I enjoy them anyway. So to cut a long story short, I read Half His Age by Jennette McCurdy. Yes, Jennette McCurdy, if you're unaware, ex-Sam on iCarly, current advocate for like mistreatment of child stars. She wrote a memoir 2 years ago now, or 3 years ago, called I'm Glad My Mom Died, which I have on my shelf that I haven't read, because I've always been told, you need to be kind of in a good place to read it. It's quite heavy and dark. I think after reading this, I am going to try and read it soon, because I'm interested to see how much of this book is kind of based on true events, or at the very least, like, based on her experiences, because it really, really feels like it's based on true experiences. It's basically about this girl called Waldo. First of all, no one in the book ever makes a Where's Waldo joke. I don't get it. But Waldo is a teenage girl she has this kind of mother who's constantly in and out of these bad relationships. She's not always there for her as a mother. She's constantly like just leaving food at home and running off with a man and, not seeing her for weeks. So she's got this kind of poor support structure. She's going to school. She has friends, but she's kind of a loner. She's not a very likable person. She's got a lot of she's very aggressive and very mean. But again, she's a teenage girl going through a poor life experience. But she ends up falling kind of for this English teacher that she has and becoming obsessed with him. And the book is then about how she seduces him. He starts, seducing her, and then they get into this kind of relationship. Obviously, very dark subject matter. Calling it an age gap relationship is too far. It is a predator relationship. But it's interesting because it doesn't depict Waldo as a kind of innocent flower who is naively seduced by this older man. Like, she actively pursues him. She actively takes part in kind of ruining his marriage. But so does he. And at the end of the day, no matter how bad Waldo gets or how unlikable she can be in certain points, you always have to remember that, yeah, but the teacher is a nonce. Like, the teacher is a pedophile. So it's a really conflicting book, because I think there's parts of it that I really like, parts of it that could be really good, but I feel like the writing is just... This is becoming a theme in this video. I don't really think the writing is that good. There's a line that I quoted in my review that I'm just going to read for you here, because I think it kind of sums up my issues with the book and Jennette McCurdy's maybe ideas about writing. She's talking to the teacher, who I can't remember his name right now, but nonce. She's talking to the nonce, and she's like, they're talking about books and authors, and he's trying to recommend stuff to her because he's mansplaining to her. And he recommends F. Scott Fitzgerald. And Waldo is like, oh, I don't really like his writing style. Like, he's too, flowery for me. And she says, Occam's razor. That's how I feel about writing. I like writing that's simple. Plainly stated observations. No fluff. I don't want to hear, it was the kind of grey morning with air so frigid that it makes your bones wail like a creaking staircase. I want to hear, it was a cold Tuesday. My bones hurt. Get to the point, This is obviously Waldo in character talking to him, but to me, that kind of sums up what the book is like. It's very to the point and matter of fact, and some people love that. Some people might love that style. I didn't gel with it. I found it kind of boring at times. I found that the world was kind of just lacking in a lot of ways. None of the characters around her really feel like real characters. She has this Mormon friend who's her only real friend, and I understand that she was going for, she's her friend who's trying to fix her. She pities her, or that's how Waldo kind of perceives their friendship. Whether that's true or not, you also have to take into account that this is an unreliable narrator. But the point is, this friend kind of just comes in and out of the story whenever necessary, and she never really feels like a full-fleshed character in my mind. Same with the mother. The mother's never really around because that's her character. But there's scenes with the mother that almost feel written for stage or something. There's this one scene where the mother comes into Victoria's Secrets, which is where Waldo works, and she's trying on all these bras, and she gives her this motivational speech about men, and it's I don't know, it felt out of place. It felt like the character suddenly turned around and started speaking directly to the audience. It's she never spoke like that up until this point in the book. So to have her suddenly be doing a soliloquy almost, felt kind of odd. I don't know. There's a lot of things in here that I think could make a good story, but it feels kind of juvenile. And not juvenile in a way that the character is meant to be a teenage girl, so she talks like a teenage girl. I'm fine with all of that. The dialogue or whatever, for the most part, is accurate, I guess. But it's very vulgar, and it's very kind of I don't know, it doesn't really feel like an adult writing a novel. Or at least, it doesn't really feel like an experienced novelist, I should say. And this is her debut. I think it's a good example of why, just because you can write a good memoir, that doesn't mean that you can write good fiction, and vice versa. There's a lot of fiction authors who write absolute dreck of, biographies and memoirs. It's why you pay a biographer to make your biography sometimes. Yeah, I was really kind of disappointed. I didn't feel like it was getting, or I felt like it was getting a lot more praise than it deserves. I do sometimes wonder, not to pull this card, but like, if this was published under a pseudonym, would people care as much? I don't know. Maybe I'm being harsh there. But I think there is going to be maybe a retrospective kind of lowering of scores by a lot of people. I think it's kind of because it's connected to her and because she has this tragic story and because we all know Jennette McCurdy. I think a lot of people are giving it a pass for things that, you wouldn't necessarily enjoy if it was written by somebody else. So that's my opinion. I think I ended up giving this a 2, which again might be a little bit harsh, but to me, again, a 2. This is a 2 of like, I was disappointed and I didn't really like a lot of the writing choices. But the story was fine. It has a satisfying-ish ending. And there's parts of it I really like. I think, again, it's brave to write a story where a teenage girl is depicted as, like, a working part of this kind of relationship rather than just a naive little thing that gets corrupted. Like, I think it has a lot to say about that kind of thing. But yeah, I don't think it was for me, and I don't think the writing style really gelled with me, so there we go. Finally, the last book I'm going to talk about is actually going to be very brief, and came right at the end of the month, and thank God, because it was a real, like, ray of sunshine after what I felt was quite a middling month of reading. This is an advanced copy that I got to read of Yesteryear by Caro Burke. For obvious reasons, this book isn't out till April, so I'm not going to talk too much about it because I don't want to get in trouble. What I will say is, oh my god, this might be a contender for Book of the Year already. I absolutely loved this book. I demolished it. I think I gave it a 5-star immediately. It is about this lady called Natalie, who is a kind of tradwifey influencer family vlogger type. And at the start of the book, you kind of see her at the kind of height of her popularity in the prologue. And she's got all of these kind of little things that are darted around that you're like, ooh, like clearly there's something happening under the surface. Like her producer just quit. Her kids don't really want them to film them anymore. And there's all these like little things. And Natalie is a mean person. Immediately you're not given the perspective of, oh look, she's so nice and soft and fun and friendly. She immediately comes across as like somebody who is just mean, like a really, really horrific person. And then this is where the book gets kind of interesting because it jumps between two different kind of narratives. You've got the past, which is kind of leading up to how she got to this point. So you see her from when she's a kid, being raised in this like fundamentalist Christian household, all the way up to like college, meeting her husband, having her kids, all that stuff. And then there's this alternate timeline. Again, it never makes it clear in the beginning, like what's actually going on. All we know is that she wakes up and she's in this kind of frontier style house where she has to actually live like a, pioneer. There's no modern conveniences. She's baking her own bread from scratch. She's doing all this stuff that she proclaims to want in her YouTube channel is now a thing. I'm not going to spoil anything, obviously, again, mainly because it's an advanced copy, but also because it's a genuinely incredible book. It's being pitched, or how it was pitched to me on the cover is The Handmaid's Tale meets Stepford Wives, which is two incredible points of reference that I adore. And again, I won't say any more about where the story kind of goes, but it's such a prescient book, I think, at this time. You would think it's a little bit late because family vloggers, controversy, things like, the Ruby Frankie stuff, and, even like Shay Carroll cheating on his wife and all that, like, those are kind of a bit in the past now. Family vloggers have kind of become, we've gone from them being like an accepted thing, which I don't understand. Not to be the friend that's too woke, or the guy who was like, oh, I'm so different. I never understood why family vloggers were seen as anything other than a fucking dirge on this website. Like, they are such an evil thing. I think filming your kids 24/7, putting videos of them crying on the internet, putting their like first everything on the, like, evil, despicable things. I don't know why we gave them a pass for so long. But this book is kind of talking about that, talking about social media and people who live their lives online, who have these, splits between their online persona and their real life persona. But it also deals with things like the manosphere and, right-wing rabbit holes. deals with what's going on in America in current year, but in a way that's not blunt. It's not a caricature of a certain politician. It is like a unique character who is clearly meant to embody certain characteristics of that person, but not actually, just being a straight up copy. Yeah, it's just a really, really, really good book, and I will probably make a video on it when it comes out fully, because I do want to talk about it. I think there's a lot in it that is worth talking about, but again, I want to give people a chance to read it, and I don't want to get in trouble. So yeah, I gave this 5 stars. There is a more in-depth review on my storygraph, but it's not as... there's no real spoilers in it, so you're not going to get much more out of it, but I highly recommend when April comes around and that book is out that you should definitely read it. If you've read one book from this list, I think it's this one. 100%. It will probably be in my end of year list for best books of the year. But yeah, so that's the 6 books I read this month. Again, kind of a bit of a mix. Mostly low reviews, a couple of high ones. Again, Yesteryear was really something that came out of nowhere and rescued me, because I was kind of a little bit down after half his age. But, I think it's important to also read stuff that's not your favorite, because then you get a better appreciation for the stuff that you do really like. So thank you for watching. If you made it this far, I really, really appreciate it. I will be doing another video like this next month, and I have a couple other videos planned, but whatever, they'll come out when they come out. But yeah, thank you for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and leave a comment. What did you think of any of these books? Have you read any of them? Did you read a lot of books in January yourself? I'd like to talk to people, so yeah, make sure you leave comments. Okay, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next month.